Keisha Rosena, and I want to welcome you all to the webinar series for the Autism Intervention Research Network for Physical Health, the AIRP. Thank you all for joining us today. So before we begin, I would like to address a few logistical details. I'll provide a brief introduction to our group of speakers today, and we will also reserve time to answer questions at the end of the presentation. Because of the number of participants, your audio will be muted throughout the call. However, you can submit questions at any point during the presentation via the chat box on your webinar console. The entire webinar is being recorded and will be available on the AIRP website, which is airpnetwork.ucla.edu. There will also be a short evaluation survey at the close of the webinar. So we invite you to provide feedback on this webinar and also to provide suggestions for future webinars. In the interest of time, let's get started. So we first want to acknowledge the Health Resources Services Administration as the funding source for the ARRP. And now I want to turn it over to our Autistic Researcher Review Board. It's my honor to introduce Dena Gassner. So please join me in welcoming Dena and the AARP Autistic Researcher Review Board.
Easier said than done, right, Kasia? Welcome, everyone. Again, my name is Dena Gassner, and I am happy on behalf of my fellow co-chair, Patrick Dwyer, to invite you to our webinar today. You see a list of names there. There's a whole lot of us who contributed to this, and really quickly, I'm going to introduce those folks to you. Slide, please. So Patrick is my partner in crime. He's the co-founder and co-chair of the ARRC, or Autistic Researchers Committee, and he's the facilitator of a local neurodivergent peer-supported community group. And his current research looks at sensory processing and attention in autism using questionnaires, behavior, eye tracking tasks, and ERPs. He's also working on exploring attention to threat in autism, neurodiversity, and intervention attitudes with autism and education. Slide. Jackie Ryan is part of the her current research is Autistic Adults' Perspective of Participatory Autism Research, which she is going to be working on today, and Understanding Autonomy and Choice from the Perspective of Autistic People with Intellectual Disabilities, plus community-based participatory research to enhance self-determination. Slide. Stephen Kapp is going to be joining us from the UK. His current research is on examining a social justice model of autism, community-based participatory studies on supporting college students, and employment and outcome measurements for autistic adults. He's also researching autistic and non-autistic people's intervention and support attitudes toward autism and their fidgeting. Slide. Me. So again, I'm Dena Gassner. I'm an adjunct professor at Towson University, and I'm the incoming co-chair of the ARRC, not following in the footsteps of, but trying hard to keep up with TC Wasteman, who was also the inaugural co-chair with Patrick last year. I'm a national board member for the ARRC-US, and I do a whole lot of other things. I'm a wife, a mother, a grandmother, and an autistic individual. And I'm currently trying to finish a dissertation on the examination of autistic individuals and their interactions with Social Security disability. Slide. Heather Brown helped to contribute to today's activities. She is at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. Her examples of her research project include understanding the experience of camouflaging in autistic women and how it affects well-being, and looking at and describing the mathematical skills of autistic adults to explore what predicts mathematical strengths and or challenges among students on the spectrum. Slide. Ari Neiman helped us today as well. He's the visiting scholar at the Lurie Institute for Disability Policy at Brandeis. He's a formal presidential appointee to the National Council on Disability and an executive board member, co-founder, and past executive director for ASAN. Slide. Marinke Aniwanu, I don't think I've ever said her last name, and I'm sorry if I said it wrong, is a humanities scholar at Rice University and is part of the Institute for Exceptional Care Executive Board. Their research interests include developmental disabilities and reproductive justice, cross-cultural narrative theory, non-traditional and stakeholder leadership, underrepresented populations, translational and transdisciplinary research. Slide. T.C. Waisman is involved with leadership, policy, and governance in her studies. She's the co-founder of this committee that's presenting this for you today. She's an editorial board member for Autism in Adulthood, the new journal that's been out very recently. Co-founder of Autism Training Academy. Her current research is on autism and universal design training for faculty, co-leading this with Dr. Kristen Gillespie Lynch. Slide. There's your beautiful face, TC. Slide. Zach Williams has also been a huge contributor to all of these processes. He's the incoming secretary for the INSAR-ARC, and his current research is on characterizing the subjective experience and neural underpinnings of sound sensitivity in autistic adults. Also, the development and validation of novel measures of mental health symptoms for the autistic population. Slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Patrick. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Dena, for that introduction. So now you have heard who we all are individually, and collectively, of course, we are autism researchers, which means that we're able to draw on a variety of different perspectives. There's the perspective that comes with being a researcher with that academic knowledge. We also come from various different points in our careers, which adds to the researcher knowledge. And then, of course, we have our personal lived experiences as autistic people. But there's also other sources of expertise, other perspectives that may be less obvious. Many of the members of our review board are family members of autistic people. Some are parents of autistic people, as well as being autistic themselves. And we're all part of the autistic community, which means that beyond our own experiences, we also are part of this community of people who are sharing experiences and developing their own concepts and constructs for understanding those that complement but are different from many of the ones that we use in research. So all these different perspectives, we think, are a really helpful combination when it comes to reviewing research ideas. But of course, we're not claiming to be, and we are not representative of all autistic people. As researchers, we are in many ways quite a privileged group. And that's one reason why we want to encourage collaboration between different ARRB sites and projects and community stakeholders outside of our review board, which is something that some of my colleagues on the review board will be talking about later in more detail. Next slide, please. So our review board, really wants to prioritize a focus on improving autistic people's well-being, and you can see a framework there that I won't fully go into details of due to time. Next slide, please. We also have some other key priorities for research in this domain of autism and physical health. We certainly want to see more focus on intersectionality and all the different intersections that one could look at there. Adults and aging, of course, that's an under-researched area in general in terms of autism, and aging is obviously particularly important to physical health. Provider and system level barriers to accessing medical care, and how those sorts of barriers are interacting with autistic differences in communication, interoception, and so on. And in general, moving beyond simple descriptive explorations of co-occurrences and towards a more mechanistic and therefore actionable understanding of what's going on at different levels. Next slide, please. So our primary goals then would include, first of all, again, promoting autistic people's health and well-being, as I was saying earlier. Secondly, promoting an evidence base that is scientifically rigorous, that's inclusive, and that's sensitive to what the community needs. And we really hope that what the ARRB is doing here could actually help inspire other research networks and organizations to use similarly innovative models to increase autistic collaboration. Next slide, please. And then again, fostering collaborations between ARRP sites and projects and community stakeholders, including autistic people and caregivers. And again, some of my colleagues will be talking more about that later. But first, we also have this goal of ensuring that results of AIRP research are communicated in a way that is not only accessible to the community, but also respectful. So I'll just take a few moments to talk about that first. We move on to the next slide, which is a title slide once we see it, so we can move straight on to the actual content too. Thank you. So when it comes to respectful terminology, I think it's interesting to go back to the late 1990s when on autistics.org you saw this thing called the Institute for the Study of the Neurologically Typical. And this very amusing parody was taking the language that we use to describe autism and other neurodevelopmental disabilities and instead applying it towards neurotypicals, talking about neurotypical syndrome as this disorder characterized by all of these symptoms that tragically affects this vast chunk of the human population that has no known cure. And there's even these wonderful little condescending remarks interspersed through it, like many neurotypicals have learned to compensate for their disabilities and interact normally with autistic people. Next slide, please. Now, this is a parody, but it's making some very serious points here, because when it's doing something like this DSM-4, describing the diagnostic criteria for this neurotypical disorder using the same sort of language and terminology that we use to describe autism, it's pointing to areas in which neurotypical people's behaviors and actions are actually contributing to the difficulties that a lot of autistic people are experiencing. So for example, it's saying that neurotypical people have an impairment in the ability to make peer friendships because they're interested in making peer friendships with other neurotypical people, not autistic people, that they in fact lack understanding of those who are different, that they have an obsessive rigidity for social conventions. So it's not perhaps autistic people who are inflexible, maybe it's neurotypical people imposing these rigid social conventions that's the problem there. That it even goes on to point out, that there's victimization, mocking and laughing at neurodivergent people. So again, this is a parody, but it's making a very serious point here that we can actually do a fairly good job of using the exact same sort of deficit language and terminology that we typically use to talk about autism. We can use that same terminology to talk about neurotypicals. Does that mean that neurotypicals are deficient or disordered? No, that's not the point here. The point here is to say that maybe these judgments of disorder and deficit are not strictly objective, that it's more complicated than that. That there are challenges, yes, but it's not clear that they're solely due to what autistic people themselves are doing. So if we move on to the next slide, I would say then that the terminology is thus exposed as reflecting these unacknowledged subjective value judgments. It's not, in fact, objective. And so we should actually probably be striving towards a more neutral descriptive technology that's just acknowledging the characteristics and challenges that are there, rather than getting into questions of attributing responsibility. Next slide, or further on the same slide, really. The other issue here is that the terminology could actually be harmful. So not only might it reflect subjective value judgments, but if you're going around calling people disordered and deficient, that could be impacting their mental health and self-esteem. We do know that perceived acceptance of autism by others is related to mental health. So whenever we can't use neutral descriptive terminology, it's probably better to err on the side of using positive strength-based language, not necessarily in an unrealistic or Pollyanna-ish way, but in a realistic but sensitive way. So if we move on to the next slide, There we go. So here's a number of specific suggestions to try and make this more concrete. So for example, instead of the term disorder, that's, saying that everything that's wrong is due to the autistic or neurodivergent person's own characteristics, we can just say disability, acknowledging the reality of the challenge. Much more neutral term. We could also, when it comes to something like autism spectrum disorder, again, say disability, or just leave off the disorder and just say autism. Another option here would be to say autism spectrum development. And this comes from sort of the principle that if it's something that's acceptable to say of neurotypical people, probably that means it's acceptable to say of autism. So typical development, autism spectrum development. And this, is sort of a general principle that I find useful. If I'm ever not sure if a particular phrase or term is respectful, I swap out the autism or disability label and instead put in, neurotypicals or some specific group, like maybe a marginalized ethnic group, and I see whether it still sounds okay. And then, if you go down the recommendations list, symptoms, red flags, risk, these are all, fairly subjectively valence terms. So we could move instead say things like characteristics, indicators, likelihood, probability, just more neutral terms. Instead of restricted, we might say focused, which, similar meaning, just more positive valence, or intense. Again, instead of saying that the autistic person is being rigid and inflexible, I think it's good for us to consider that maybe both the autistic person and, neurotypical people or society around them might be being inflexible. Usually inflexibility isn't a problem. If it's only one person being inflexible, then other people presumably can be flexible about that. Instead of comorbid, co-occurring. Instead of terms like problem or challenging behavior, you could say distressed, which puts a bit more emphasis on the first person experiences of the individual themselves, or you could just be more specific, say exactly what it is, since problem or challenging is such a vague term. Similarly, these functioning labels, severity classifications, extremely vague, so more specific descriptions would be really helpful. Or you could, if you want to be vague, say something about the support needs of the individual, for example. Next slide, please. Of course, another major terminology controversy here is that between person-first language and identity-first language. So person-first language would be saying something like person with autism. And the idea here is you want to emphasize the personhood of the individual, make sure that the disability isn't characterizing or taking over their whole identity. And this is something that actually a lot of people sort of reacted against. And they were pointing out, well, do we go around saying things like person with femaleness? No, we don't say that sort of thing. We tend to be pretty comfortable with using terms like woman. So why is this? Could it be that our desire to distance the disability label from the person, in fact, reflects some sort of stigma towards that disability label? Is it reflecting implicit negative attitudes there? Why can't we take pride in our neurodivergent and disabled identities? So hence identity first language, autistic person, putting the identity first. Now, if we could move on to the next point on the slide, there is a middle ground position here. Person on the autism spectrum is not necessarily the preferred term of a lot of individuals, but I think we all tend to agree that it's a good compromise position that's not offensive to anyone. The most important principle here, though, is that you always do want to respect the identifying language preferences of any specific individual on the spectrum that you happen to be interacting with. Next slide, please. Now, a lot of these terminology considerations seem to be related to this idea of neurodiversity and neurodiversity advocacy. And we don't have time to unpack all the ins and the outs of this, but there's a lot of misunderstandings, I think, about what this term means, and that, it tends to complicate debates and disagreements about the subject. It just adds a lot of confusion. So it doesn't necessarily help too that neurodiversity has multiple meanings, some of them descriptive or factual, some of them prescriptive. To start with just the descriptive factual sort of angle here, neurodiversity just means that all minds and brains are different. When Judy Singer, along with others like Harvey Bloom and the people on the Independent Living Autism listserv, were initially developing this concept, they were thinking, well, we use the term biodiversity to refer to diversity of species and ecosystems. Why can't we use the term neurodiversity to refer to the reality that there's diversity of minds and brains in human societies? So in that sense, it's just a descriptive term. And you can use then the term neurodiverse to refer to a group that has people with a diversity of minds or brains. People would argue that this only makes sense when applied to groups. You can't apply it to individuals because any individual has only one mind or brain. That being said, sometimes the term neurodiverse is used as a synonym for neurodivergent, which most people would probably consider to be an incorrect usage. So neurodivergent means having a mind or brain that is deviating from societal standards of what's considered to be normative in a way that's associated with disability. So this can be applied to groups or specific individuals. I myself am autistic, which means that I'm a neurodivergent person. You can also use the term neurominority to refer to specific groups of neurodivergent people. Next slide, please. But neurodiversity is not just descriptive, it's also prescriptive. Actually, could we go back to the previous slide? I got ahead of myself there for a second. If you go back up to that quote at the top here from Judy Singer, why not propose that just as biodiversity is essential to ecosystem stability, so neurodiversity may be essential for culture? That, is definitely prescriptive. It's not just descriptive. It's saying that neurodiversity is a good thing. So if we move back to the next slide, sorry for shuffling back and forth there. Neurodiversity then is referring to this whole political movement that's opposing cures and normalization for autism and many other forms of neurodivergence, that's instead advocating for acceptance, for support, for respect for autistic people's and neurodivergent people's self-determination, and promotion of well-being. Advocates here don't believe that acceptance should be conditional. Acceptance should just be a right, that everybody should be able to feel that there's nothing wrong with who they are as a person. And this is definitely not just about autism. The neurodiversity movement, is very intentionally supposed to be broader than that. And so you see a lot of neurodiversity advocates, for example, in the ADHD world, in terms of learning disabilities, many different neurominorities. But I said there's a lot of misunderstandings about neurodiversity, what it means. And one of these really seems to revolve around just what exactly it means to reject cure. So neurotypical people, they learn skills, right? They're constantly learning, not just in childhood, but throughout adulthood as well. So neurodiversity advocacy is not opposed to teaching people useful adaptive skills. It's just opposed to the idea that that should be used to say there's something wrong with who they are. We can teach people skills without trying to cure them or change them into somebody else, if that makes sense. Another key point here is that the opposition to cure only applies to things that are perceived to not be medical problems. If something is a medical problem, then yeah, taking a medical cure-oriented approach is totally acceptable within the neurodiversity movement. And this is a very important point to make here in terms of physical health and co-occurring physical health conditions, many of which will in fact be medical problems. So for example, I think most neurodiversity advocates would tend to agree that epilepsy, gastrointestinal problems, that sort of thing are genuinely medical problems. You also see an interesting middle ground here where, for example, anxiety might be something where you don't want people to feel there's something wrong with them because of an elevated clinically significant anxiety level. But on the other hand, maybe the individual would want to get that anxiety down. So there's sort of a gray area where maybe some neurodiversity principles apply and not others. If we can move on to the next slide, I find it really helpful to reflect on different models that are used to describe disability and where neurodiversity fits here. So this medical model that you see on the left, that's this idea that disability challenges are solely located within the person, which I've already opined reflects subjective value judgments, and therefore the solution is you want to cure the person to normalize them. The social model over on the far right, in its strong form, is pretty much the exact opposite position. Here, we have this interesting distinction between disability and impairment. Impairment is the thing that's located within the person, but that's not directly causing the disability. The disability is coming from society's failure to accommodate and include people. So for example, a neurodivergent person who has job relevant skills, but who is unable to obtain employment because of an atypical social presentation in job interviews, that disability, that barrier that's preventing them from accessing employment is coming from society. And the solution to that would be to reform society to put in place some alternative job assessment that would allow them to get employment. But this strong version of the social model sometimes breaks down because sometimes it's not clear if a particular neurodivergent characteristic is going to be, it sometimes seems like it could be disabling in pretty much any environment that you can think of, which is where we come to this middle ground here of interactionist or ecological approaches, social relational approaches. There's many different names for more or less similar ideas here. And this is the idea that both characteristics of the person and of their environment could contribute to disability, and therefore we could, either try to reform society or to change individuals, not necessarily by curing if the problem is not a medical problem, but perhaps by teaching adaptive skills. So the neurodiversity movement, I would argue, fits in this interactionist middle ground. Certainly that's what Judy Singer was initially proposing, and I think if you look at what neurodiversity advocates tend to say about adaptive skills, I think you can see that the neurodiversity movement fits in there. So hopefully that provides some useful concepts. I know that was a huge amount of information in a very short time, but thank you for bearing with me. And I'm happy now to hand things over to Jackie Ryan, who will actually be talking about the topic of our webinar, participatory research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. So I'm going to be presenting on a small study that I did while I was a visiting student at the University of Edinburgh. So I was looking at the experience of autistic adults in the UK, their experiences of participatory autism research. So participatory autism research is an umbrella term that encompasses a variety of participatory approaches to include autistic people as more than subjects, for example, as advisors, collaborators, or partners. So these could include community-based participatory research, action research, participatory action research, etc. This study was developed during my study term at the University of Edinburgh, and I was looking to update the findings from a 2014 study by Pellicano et al. In terms of the autistic people's perspectives of research community engagement in autism research. Basically, has anything changed in the 5 years since then? I was supervised by Professor Sue Fletcher Watson, and I collaborated with KB Brooke, an autistic activist in Inverness, Scotland. Next slide, please. So autistic people have not been involved in research as they would like to be. There are differences in priorities between the autism community and the autistic community. And for clarity, when I talk about the autistic community, I'm talking about actually autistic people. When I'm talking about the autism community, I'm including researchers, family members, professionals, allies. So the autistic community is a subset of the autism community. So the two groups have different research priorities. And with the autistic community being most interested in research to improve quality of life. Yet autism researchers have been reluctant to engage autistic people. And in fact, a recent study by Holland and Pierce found that researchers describe engagement with the autistic community as difficult due to political differences within the autistic community, and interestingly, autistic impairments, which exacerbates researcher reluctance to engage with the autistic community. Next slide, please. So our main research question was, what are the perspectives and experiences of the autistic community of participatory autism research, or PAR? And then we supported that by asking these questions. What do you think about PAR? What are some of the barriers to PAR? What has worked well in your experience of PAR? How could PAR be supported in the future? What do you wish autism researchers knew about being autistic? And how would you like to be involved in autism research? Next slide, please. So we used an asynchronous focus group platform called Collaborators to collect the data. The questions were posted and participants had 1 week to answer the questions and respond to other participants' answers. So the dialogue was carried on throughout the week. Then we used Braun and Clark's thematic analysis framework to identify themes and sub-themes. And we achieved consensus between the two main researchers via email discussion and review by our supervisor. Next slide, please. So we identified two main themes, that of respect and authenticity. So the theme of respect related to valuing autistic individuals' time, attending to their accessibility needs, including autistic people with co-occurring conditions and other intersectionalities, using sensitive language and providing accurate information about autism. This theme is exemplified by this comment from a participant. They said, "I feel like we spend so much of our energy educating people about the same dozen or so things. I also find it rather ironic and just painful that people who are researching autism still need to hear these things. I would suggest that researchers simply spend time with autistic people, even if it's only online, and listen to the things that we say." The theme of authenticity related to trust, open and honest communication, ethics, tokenism, and recognition that autistic people can be experts in more than their lived experience. This theme is elucidated by this comment from a participant who said, "I would love it if all research had to go through an autistic ethics review board in the same way other ethics boards works." Next slide, please. And finally, this research supported earlier findings that autistic people are not involved in research as they would like to be. The findings also endorse the Aspire practice guidelines for the inclusion of autistic adults as co-researchers that Dr. Kapp will be presenting next. The findings also align with topics that were identified by Fletcher Watson and al. In 2018. And interestingly, our findings contrasted with Holland and Pierce findings that difficulties with engaging with the autistic community in research stem from autistic impairments. In fact, one of the participants talked about her ability to mediate disagreements in studies she has taken part in. The study had several limitations. We had a small sample size. We were only recruited participants who lived in the UK, and we did not include any autistic people who had higher support needs. And also, interestingly, I was really excited about using this asynchronous online platform. I thought that it might meet the needs of autistic people, but the people who participated in this study actually didn't like the platform. They found that it required too much initiation to use it. And so that's what I found and learned when I was studying in the UK. And now I will turn it over to Stephen Kapp to talk about the Aspire guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. So yes, thanks for leading into this, mentioning the Aspire practice-based guidelines. I'm presenting on including autistic adults as co-researchers and recommendations from these guidelines. As background to the guidelines, this is actually research that I've done in partnership with Dr. Kristen Gillespie Lynch, an associate professor in psychology, who we were shared primary authors of this study, and about expertise of autistic people. And arguably, autistic adults' expertise about autism can fall under, well, at least relevant to our findings. In general, there's experiential expertise, and which is expertise from the lived experience of being autistic. And so that would, for direct lived experience, that would be unique to autistic people. And empirical evidence we found is relevant to this because we asked both some open-ended questions that we coded. We also have quantitative data. In this case, we had an open-ended question about how would you define autism in your own words? And we saw that through content analysis, that autistic adults, or people were more likely to define autism kind of experientially, so from the inside, including referring to perception or other aspects of emotion or cognition, or any aspect of the brain or genes or biology, things on the that are more internal. Whereas autism is, of course, defined by behavior, which gives anyone, especially someone on the outside in a way, because you could, in some ways, if you're external, you can more easily observe someone's full literal behavior, maybe more easily than someone from directly in that body in a way. But, whereas the inside is something, again, that only we have direct access to. But, there are all sorts of reasons, that may underlie our actual behavior, and that might be the true autism, just the way a lot of autistic people say it, and hence kind of the neurodiversity kind of term that autistic adults, the term that we coin and use, as Patrick talked about. So, and also autistic people were more likely to define autism in a balanced way that incorporated neutral differences as well as potential positives, but also incorporating challenges. It was unusual for people to talk about autism only positively, but it's usually strengths and weaknesses. If people mention strengths, it would be in combination, which is, I think, more in line with the neurodiversity framework, autism as a difference, not as an overall advantage. And also there's kind of traditional expertise of autistic people that this was the Autism Awareness Scale, which goes back to the 1980s and has been revised as scientific knowledge of autism has been updated over the years. And so it's based on the latest scientific understanding of autism. And autistic participants reported the most knowledge on this measure, and higher knowledge related to lower stigma. So autistic adults also have the least stigma toward autistic people. And actually the higher knowledge was especially where autistic adults had exceeded the other scores. It was especially on items that were more strengths related, because the understanding of autism has, become more nuanced. And if we go to the next slide, please. So ASPIRE, which is an acronym for the Academic Autism Spectrum Partnership in Research and Education, is a leader in community-based participatory autism research, and I'll go into that framework a bit. It was formed in 2006. I joined 10 years ago. It's co-directed by Christina Nicolaitis, who is a professor and an internal medicine, medical doctor, and also a mother of an autistic, now adult, child at the time, and Dora Raymaker, who was at the time working toward a graduate certificate, so before a master's degree and now PhD. And so Christina was the academic co-director, and Dora was the kind of community co-director. Did I say Dora is autistic? So, and whereas Christina is not. And then for Aspire, so community-based participatory research means equal partnership with the autistic community, and it includes the lay autistic community, not just autistic researchers like are part of this review board, but also lay, non-academic co-researchers. And studies that I've partnered on have been about healthcare, employment, autistic burnout, and outcome measurement. And when I joined, I didn't yet have a master's degree either. And so I was considered a community partner. Now I'm something like an assistant professor in Americanese. I'm from LA. So by the terms that my university uses, I'm called a lecturer. I do research and teaching as part of it, and it's the closest thing to tenure that I already have in our system. So, and so I'm no longer a community partner, but I'm an academic partner, even though I'm an autistic academic partner, of course. So somehow I forgot to replace should be the academic, it should be our practice-based guidelines slide that was published in Autism, and it's last year, and it's open access. But anyway, so free of charge. So somehow that was on an older version. Anyway, so if we go to the next slide, please. So there is the proper citation. But and so the inclusion guidelines, They were actually for including autistic people as both co-researchers, which is the main point of this talk, but also as research participants. So generally, just to quickly covering autistic people, including them as research participants, the general principle is to protect autistic participant and human subjects while maximizing the autonomy and inclusion of autistic adults. So for example, only accessing, assessing the capacity to participate if necessary. If someone's participating independently online in a survey, I don't think we don't think their capacity to participate needs to be assessed. But and only including proxy reporters like parents or caregivers for an autistic adult if necessary, if that adult can't participate. And the adult should be given, or participant should be given an opportunity for support to participate. They can still, as long as they're actually the one giving their views, it's okay to have support to participate. And it also, it's important to create accessible data collection processes and materials, including the consent process, modes of participation, and surveys, interviews, etc. And you can read more about this in our paper, and also in our collaboration toolkit that's on our website. So next slide, please. And so the first kind of guideline for including autistic people as co-researchers from our guidelines is to match the goals the research partnership has with the approach it's taking to the level of engagement. And it should be transparent about the level of engagement with, autistic, with the autistic collaborators and the outside world. And so 3 main levels of engagement that we discuss are equal partnership. So community-based participatory research is a type of that. It's been done with other marginalized groups, and it's a type of emancipatory research, and it's trying to serve the goals that that the community wants, that directly empower the community through the actual practical results and what have you. And the research process itself is empowering because it's about sharing power equally, whereas typically the researchers obviously have more power than the lay co-researchers, because again, it's important that not every person from the community is academic. Sometimes when you're an academic, it can also shade your perspective. I can, speak from personal experience, and although I can also speak from literally my personal experience as just an autistic person, it's important to have autistic people with all sorts of experiences, so background. So and another level of engagement is authentic collaboration or engagement. So an example of this is patient and stakeholder engagement. So this is a level where the autistic collaborators would have more, it's more than just input, it's more meaningful participation than just something that you say something and then that could be totally discarded. It might not have any influence. And, arguably, although we're, professional in a sense in that we're different types of academic researchers, this could be something that the Autistic Researchers Review Board just kind of engaging in this sort of, although the areas are a bit gray. And then there's another level of engagement that's it's basically consultation, which might be one time or it might be ongoing. But again, it's kind of just giving input, but you know, the team can do what they want with it, and it's not necessarily having that strong an impact. So next slide, please. So the next principle is about, you know, and some of these are my own words, of course, but partnering with suitable people and well-defined roles. Well, I mean, that's basically all, you know, my paraphrasing, but and so it's important to identify partners who share a long-term vision, share the same long-term vision for the, you know, what they want to see for, let's say, the autistic community, what they want to see from this research project, and who prioritize the group's goals, you know, over individual gain or what have you. So partner, yeah, I think because everyone, well, I'll get into that, but I think partner with autistic people with different types of lived experience, you know, including, you know, different, not just about autism, but also different intersectional issues, different educational backgrounds, different racial and ethnic backgrounds, and gender backgrounds, and maybe who have experience living in a, or currently live, you know, in a group setting, or, you know, who potentially received certain therapies, or who have different experiences with services, or whatever it might be, who might be, you know, AAC users, or non-speaking, or have an intellectual disability, and what have you. And partner with autistic people with diverse levels of community connection. So it's not just leaders, but also potentially, because there are different autism or autistic advocacy organizations, but not, and we do have, you know, an autistic self-advocacy network representative, for example, but also people who are not tied to any particular organizations, and, you know, might not even be all that involved in the autistic community outside of Aspire, and everything in between. Because again, these all will shape people's experiences and perspectives and what have you. It's important to try to represent different experiences, and also partner with non-autistic people as needed who agree to share power. So this could be practitioners, researchers who have relevant expertise and experience for the study. If it's about healthcare, then, you know, having nurses and doctors may be quite relevant and necessary even. So everyone basically needs to put aside their ego and seek to achieve, well, and potentially a consensus. That's how, but whatever means of working together that's agreed upon, we in Aspire, you know, seek to achieve a well-earned consensus. So I think, so yeah, you don't need to necessarily have a formal application process, but if you do, you know, you should probably make and review it as a team, do everything you can as a team. Next slide, please. So another principle is to create processes for sharing information and power, including for procedures for communicating inside and outside meetings. For example, in Aspire, we have templates for emails, and they have clear headings and sections within the emails. For example, they'll say what actions are expected to be taken, if any, might be just for your information, any details, the deadline, any stipend if applicable, and then within meetings to provide a clear agenda sent in advance and other materials for the meeting sent in advance, and strong facilitation, time management and what have you is not always the strong suit of all of us. So help us stay on track and, respectfully and effectively and what have you. And offer accessible methods for participation. It could be multiple simultaneously as needed. For example, when Aspire was first founded and over the first, until quite recently, until the last year or so, I believe, we met by text chat. It was Skype, and then it's moved to Zoom because of the preference of an individual. And well, it's not really just a prep, but really access needs need to trump preferences. And, sometimes actually access needs for some autistic people, make things more inconvenient and difficult for non-autistic people. So at the beginning, text chat was more accessible to all the autistic, or at least as accessible to all the autistic partners. And, things are written down. You don't need to process visual cues, etc., which made it more difficult for some non-autistic partners like Christina, who is used to the more, this sort of talking out loud with sight and sound together format, and like video chat, or or at least teleconferences or whatever. But now we have a partner with an intellectual disability, a partner who's blind, and a partner who's an AAC user who types to communicate. So 3 separate people, and so we need to provide the option to speak in the meetings or have sound, and to have closed captioning for any sounds, speech, and what have you. And we also, still have text chat if needed for those who need, and someone reads what's written aloud. So, so people for whom one method is not accessible can still participate and understand. And it's important to have a method for making decisions. So next slide. In the example of Aspire, we use something we call a 5-finger method, and we covered that in this paper in 2011. Actually, I wasn't even, I was just joining as it was getting put, but Aspire has a paper about it. And we, you can see that it's basically, you might love it, you might like it, you might need to talk about it further, you might dislike it, or you might hate it so much that you're willing to kind of veto it. And we need to come to a consensus. I've never seen Aspire not ultimately be able to at least get everyone to agree to live with it, It almost always, at least through discussion, because if there are any fours, if anyone just dislikes it, but they're willing to live with it, we still need to discuss it. And if everyone loves it or likes it, we just move on. But if anyone has any questions or if they dislike it but can live with it, we discuss. Obviously, if they hate it, we discuss it and try to get it to work for everyone. And then as long as everyone has a 1, 2, or even this kind of dislike but can live with it, this 4, then we can move on. And again, usually through discussion, everyone at least likes it. So next slide. And there's not too much more. This is, I think, the final slide. And there's a bunch of quick principles that I put together. So there's the importance of building and maintaining trust. Solidify the shared goals. It's important for researchers to demonstrate, including non-autistic researchers and non-autistic practitioners and professionals, especially to demonstrate that they value lived experience. And so autistic partners, co-researchers can feel comfortable sharing their own, personal experience and the experience of others they know and what have you, even if they don't have as much technical knowledge, if they don't have as much traditional kind of academic expertise or what have you. And it's important to listen to the group, to implement the group's decisions and report back to the group on the progress, and to formally self-evaluate the collaboration. And one thing we do that really formally every once in a while, but we also, at the end of every meeting, we have a keep change exercise. What would you like to keep that we did well, you think, or what would you like to change? And we don't have the time to cover it. And even so, we generally will send it out by email to discuss further. So we disseminate our findings together. People who worked on a study always have the opportunity to be a co-author and to collaborate on presentations, for example. We encourage skill building to essentially help people like Dora and I become academic partners potentially, but which also means now we've always had this kind of community council, and since Dora is also an academic now, the community councils really of lay autistic people, it's important, for they have an important voice as well in making decisions with the aspired co-directors and with the staff, and manage power differentials. When people like Dora and I, when we become academics, we shouldn't substitute for community partners. And actually, I had to kind of make way by no longer being a community partner. We have to, we needed to hire more other autistic community partners. And it's critical to fairly pay community partners, which is especially important when non-autistic staff or just any staff or research participants are paid. If it's a non-funded project and no one has any money toward it, then at least we can commiserate. But usually researchers have some funding for our time in some respect, academics, and we used to be paid, community partners were paid $25 for 2-hour meetings 10 years ago. And now minimum wage is higher than $12.50 an hour in many parts of the country. And we pay, and then also as we've gotten more grants and been able to pay more, now we pay $25 an hour. So it's $50 for 2 hours. And I don't know that there's any magic formula to what a going rate is. We just do what we can to pay people. And we, anyway, thank you very much. And I think that about wraps it, and we also need time for Q&A. So I think I'm done. If we can move to the next, the INSAR, SIG, or whatever else.
Dena, I think that you were gonna had something to say on this slide, or Patrick on the Autistic.
Absolutely, I'm happy to do that. So this is our commercial break for the end of the session. We just wanted to let you know that we're very excited that we have full capacity at our first year of this SIG. It's called Building the Strengths of Autistic Scholars by Addressing Systemic Barriers to Autistic Success in Academia. So in this first year, we're going to be looking at primarily 3 groups of participants. We were going to be looking at the experiences of autistic researchers, the observations of their colleagues as they collaborate with autistic researchers, and the employers or supervisors as the individuals who are autistic are experiencing the application process and that transition into and first year adjustment for graduate school. Each year we will be adding more time to this. In the second year, we're going to be looking at the actual experience of graduate school beyond the first year up until graduation. And the final year, we're going to be looking at postdoc placements and employment. So we're very excited about this. We're building on the research that's already been done by some of the people you heard today. And our primary keynote speaker for that day is going to be Sandra Jones, who's done a lot of work in this area already. We are still very, very much in need of facilitators. There's 2 divisions. There are note takers and people to prompt the questions. And so if you are already registered, unfortunately, registration is closed, but if you're already registered and you can participate in either of those capacities, or you can handle both parts, we would really love to hear from you. So just let us know, and I'll put my email in the chat, and you can reach out to me if you'd like to help us out. We're really, really hungry to have you. Thanks.
Just a quick clarification from me. So the registration for the INSAR SIG specifically is closed, but if you want to be a discussion facilitator and you are registered for the entire INSAR meeting, not specifically this SIG, it would still be possible to sneak you in. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick.
Wow. Well, thank you very much thank you, Anna. Perfect timing on the slide change. Thank you all very, very much to all of the presenters. Thank you for your work, for your advocacy, and for being an integral part of the ARRB network. I could probably spend an hour and a half talking just about how amazing it's been as an autism researcher working with the ARRB members, everybody in our ARRB. And so it's really awesome for you all to be able to provide more of that information for others. So we now have time for some questions and answers. I'll start. I know there was at least one question that was already submitted, but please feel free to type additional questions in the chat box and I can read them aloud for the presenters. I'll also post a link for a feedback survey in the chat in just a minute. So there were some answers being put in the chat throughout the webinar, but there was one person who asked a question about resources and being able to connect with others. So they said, what has been the most effective tool for the community of autistic co-researchers to engage between them and with partners broadly? And then they also said, you mentioned a listserv, which I think Dena provided some more information that they're in the process of creating a database. But I wasn't sure if anybody had anything else to add there. So what has been the most effective tool for the community of autistic co-researchers to engage between them and with partners more broadly?
In terms of the database, I can just quickly say some more about that. So this is not a resource that exists currently, but it's one that we hope will exist soon. So a lot of us on the ARRP, ARRB are also on the INSAR Autistic Researchers Committee. Sorry about all the acronyms there. Zach Williams has in particular been doing a lot of work to develop a database that could be used to try and match researchers and community co-researchers who'd be interested in, collaborating on any specific projects in terms of helping co-researchers and academic researchers find one another. And again, that does not exist at present, but we're hoping that sometime after this year's INSAR meeting, we'll be able to focus on getting that up there. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on, but I'm not sure if the question was intended to ask about that question of finding one another versus the question of how to, tools to support a collaboration and make it work once people are in contact.
Stephen, I think, were you adding something? You're muted.
I think there's also a toolkit that's based in the UK that autistic people develop, and I'm trying to remember if I can think of the name, so I'll try to keep thinking.
And also, Stephen, you mentioned something from Aspire earlier that you wanted to share. You could also drop that in the chat as well if it's easily findable. No pressure whatsoever at all. I just remember you saying that. Yeah, I think that they were asking, Patrick, you were trying to ask a question about if they seem to be asking about like connecting with other autistic co-researchers or with like other partners more broadly. And I think that they were asking about both. Just from the read of the question, both how do they connect with other autistic researchers, and then also how could they connect with other possible collaborators more broadly. So I think the information that you all provided, I was asking about maintaining the engagement and communication broadly. So I don't know if anybody has anything else to add on that as well. I'll also add a link to the survey in the chat right now. Sorry, Dena, I think you unmuted. We're going to add something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we're the autistic researchers have been unearthing each other at INSAR for quite some time. And depending on your particular research matter, the subject, the focus of the inquiry, qualitative or quantitative, if we have some idea, informally, no guarantees, everybody has to vet each other's people, but we kind of know who each other are. And we can maybe help you out if you have a particular interest in collaboration. I can also say that, in addition to Christina's work and their work at Aspire, Teal Benavides out of Georgia has done some pretty significant community participatory research as it applies to autistic experiences with both mental and physical health care. We're about to drop another research article here very soon. And so one of the other ways you can find collaborators is to possibly just look for PCORI funded research because it's required by their funding stream. So there's a couple of ways you can, less formally, we don't have that database yet, but there's some other ways you can come across collaborators if you're looking for them.
Also, in terms of facilitating connections among autistic researchers, whether academic or otherwise, there are some social media groups. So, for example, there's this Facebook group. There's another one as well, but that's like private, secret group, not publicly findable. And of course, there's Twitter hashtags and things that Twitter Addy could say more about. I'm not really on Twitter properly.
Social media is a good suggestion, Patrick. We've also been trying to really encourage and work more with the AARP social media to try to find more places for individuals to be able to come together. I dropped the link for the feedback survey, which is also on your screen, in the chat. I also am going to provide a link to the AARP website in case that's helpful for individuals. And then I'll also provide a link to join the AARP network by joining the AARP newsletter.
Another way autistic researchers might meet each other. Did someone say the hashtag Autistics in Academia on Twitter or potentially elsewhere? And Patrick alluded to Facebook groups. Technically, the groups are listed as secret, so but I think that means maybe their existence isn't necessarily, but you have to be autistic in order to join. So I think we can, or maybe they're not, this one's private. I think maybe they used to be. Okay, so if it's private, then I can, it's, one is autistic researchers researching autism. Did you say it specifically, Patrick? And then there's, I'm just gonna make sure it's not,
yeah, yeah,
Autistic,
the one
autism researchers is the other one. It's private, not secret, so I can say that.
yeah, the one I posted is autistic researchers researching autism. That's the one that you can at least see exists. Autism researchers, I don't think you can see exists.
Oh, you can see it's private now.
Oh,
So it's not secret. Can? Yeah. I think one or both of them used to be secret, so, but then it might defeat the purpose. Yeah.
Just reach out to us, we'll help you out.
I'm also learning more about the difference between private and secret Facebook groups, so that's helpful. Next slide, please. I also wanted to just end. We have another minute or two. If anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I also wanted to highlight our upcoming webinar. So our May webinar will be hosted by our neurology node leader, Dr. Rajutha Wilson, and it will focus on the brain and body in motion, understanding and supporting motor dysfunction in autism. So if there are no other questions, then I want to thank everyone for attending today. As we said, the webinar has been recorded and will be archived on the AARP website, so you can view the recording there, and we'll also post the slides there as well. Please take a few moments to complete our survey so we can learn more about what would be helpful to have for future webinars. And then also don't hesitate to reach out if you have any additional questions or you want to connect with the AIRP or with our Autistic Researchers Review Board, the ARRB, or if you have any questions about the millions of acronyms that we've thrown at you during the webinar today. But we are all very approachable and very happy to help.
We have a question.
Yeah, it looks like it. So given that parents of young autistic children often learn terminology and perspective from within the medical model, do you find it helpful or necessary to introduce other models in beginning autism community collaborations?
I can just speak for the PCORI grant that I participated in. We sort of began our first orientation and meeting by disclosing that we were going to be looking at these experiences through the lens of neurodiversity. And, you know, if anybody had any questions about what that meant, we were happy to show them. I know I teach transition to adulthood, and in my class, we exclusively use a neurodiversity lens, which is quite a cultural shift for many of my students because I teach in health sciences, not special education. And they're coming from a very medical model, speech pathologists, frequently it's special educators, hospitalists that are working with people in a hospital environment. And so, you know, we are in our own ways, I think, individually, just sort of helping people to understand that at least they have options We always defer to the individual family or the person's choice of identity as we would any other minority identity status. But we do try to gently nudge them toward understanding the respect and the dignity that comes from the neurodiversity lens that might leave, I can speak as a parent, it makes me feel a lot more hopeful about my son's future and my future experiences as an autistic researcher.
And I'll just add one more, completely disinterested, not at all biased thing, because I may happen to be a co-author on this, but Heather Brown, who is another member of our Autistic Researcher Review Board, has an editorial forthcoming in Autism on the topic of how diagnosticians can support a neurodiversity perspective from the start. So that gets that point of parents of young autistic children and introducing them to other models. So once that comes out, hopefully in the next very near future, I think you'd probably find that an interesting read. And again, I am completely unbiased because I'm just a co-author, so it's not like I have any incentive whatsoever to promote this work. That was a joke. A bad one.
Yes, but by the way, I did post a Start Here guide by the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, a guide for parents of autistic kids, which is free if you want to look at an electronic copy or pay for, other versions. And they're also actually, in the case of autistic people who are finding out they're autistic for the first time, if they're old enough, there's an adolescent version, there's an adult version of the Welcome to the Autistic Community free guides and there's a audio of it too, I think, video. Welcome to the Autistic Community guides for autistic people who recently found out they're autistic.
We only have a minute or two left, but there was one other question that came in that I wanted to see if we could answer. Autistic adults have historically not been involved in early intervention research and development. What important contributions do you think autistic adults can bring to this field? Can early intervention embrace a neurodiversity lens? There was an article that was recently published on early intervention work specifically, and including more of the neurodiversity lens with that I'll see if I can find in the next minute or two. But I'm not sure if anybody wants to try to answer that. So autistic adults have historically not been involved in early intervention research. So what important contributions do you think autistic adults can bring to this field? Can early intervention embrace a neurodiversity lens?
I would like to think so. And I am very actively trying to work on this. Dena and Jackie and I are actually all part of this discussion group that's meeting regularly of autistic and non-autistic researchers to talk about these, very fraught and controversial subjects of early intervention and ABA and everything. And there's also research that I would highly recommend that, again, I am collaborating on, so I have some vested interest here, but Rachel Schuck and Caitlin Penner at the University of California, Santa Barbara have done some research asking autistic adults about their perceptions of early intervention. And that will be presented in 2 different posters at the upcoming INSAR conference. If you're interested in this topic and attending INSAR, I highly suggest that you check those out because there's some very interesting findings that could point towards some ways of reforming these things in ways more acceptable to the community.
And one of the things that I've brought up to the committee this informal group that we're having is the idea of doing research on individuals who have had positive outcomes without any early intervention. I'm the parent of a 31-year-old young man who was told by a major medical center that he would never live independently, and he's got a bachelor's degree now. And to be very, very personally blunt, we couldn't afford ABA. So I think we haven't even begun to examine those persons. And I think there's a big void in the literature there in looking at outcomes that were not necessarily benefited or affected by, if you will, early intervention. We did a little bit of sensory work for a while. That became too overwhelming. We did some early speech services. And what we really found out is underlying the autism, we had an individual who presented with very severe learning disabilities and processing issues. So once we treated him like an individual with a learning disability, he was able to succeed academically. So I'm interested to see if we might not be able to examine that other part of the dialogue a little bit more specifically.
It looks like we're at time, but I do just want to quickly point out that the amount of resources that have been shared in the chat in the last just few minutes is phenomenal, and it gives me a lot of hope, right, that there is more information out there on these really important topics. I put the ARRB email in the chat. So we have to end now, but if anybody wants to continue this conversation further, please don't hesitate to reach out. We are here and happy to communicate and collaborate. So we definitely encourage any of you who are interested to reach out to us. Thank you everyone very, very much for attending the webinar today. And thank you very much, sorry, Dena, thank you very much to all of our presenters for our Autistic Researchers Review Board.
Take care, everyone. Bye.